welcome to Feminist Question Time, brought to you by Women's Human Rights Campaign, the leading global organisation defending women's sex-based rights against the threats posed by gender identity ideology. We have more information on the website womensdeclaration.com, where you will find our Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights, which has been signed by 19,010 people from 138 countries and is supported by 357 organisations. As well as signatories to the declaration, we have activists, and we currently have country contacts defending women's sex-based rights in 46 countries. If you'd like to get involved and help WHRC's actions, there's a volunteer form on our website, and we'll hopefully put it in the chat, but on the website, womensdeclaration.com. I'm really delighted because this week we have Kath Aiken from the UK talking about the United Nations position on women's rights and WHRC's lobbying and explanation of our worries about gender identity ideology towards the United Nations. We hope to have María Nacrur from Chile, who's the country contact for Chile, doing a country report. We have Evelina Niemi from Finland. She's the country contact for Finland for Women's Human Rights Campaign, and she'll be telling us about what's happening in Finland at the moment. And we have Holly Lawford-Smith from Australia. She's a political philosopher, women's rights activist, and creator of the website noconflicttheysaid.org, which gathers anecdotal evidence of the ways in which sex self-identification impacts on women. She'll be talking about, I think, that, but also talking about how trans activists are gaming intersectionality and how gender critical feminism shouldn't be intersectional. So I'm going to hand over now to Kath Aiken from the UK and to talk about the Generation Equality Forum, the UN proposal, and WHRC's response. So welcome, Kath.
Okay, I'm going to. This is our news report about WHRC and our actions with the UN recently. So CEDAW, CSW, NGO CSW, UNWomen, and the appropriation of feminism. CEDAW is the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. It was adopted by the UN in 1979 and was the culmination of more than 30 years' work by CSW, the UN Commission on the Status of Women. This is the principal global intergovernmental body for promoting women's rights and shaping sex equality standards. CEDAW is the document on which our Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights is based. CSW holds an annual 2-week gathering in New York, where representatives from UN member states meet to discuss progress in implementing the 1995 Beijing Declaration, among other things. During this fortnight, NGO CSW also takes place. This is a gathering of civilian NGOs with an apparent women's rights focus, which is supposed to work to ensure the voices of women's rights and feminist organisations are heard by CSW. UNWomen was set up in 2010 to support women's equality and freedom from discrimination as set out in CEDAW. It should be the primary instrument standing up for the rights of women and girls. UNWomen, along with Mexico and France, have organised the Generation Equality Forum, which should have ended last year. This is a series of meetings intended to renew commitments to advance women's rights 25 years after the Beijing platform. They created action coalitions to decide the new agenda, collaborate and find funding from companies, philanthropists, governments, civil society and UN agencies for the next 5 years. We should be able to look to UNWomen as the defender of our rights as set out in CEDAW, but sadly this is not the case, as we know firsthand from our own experience at NGO CSW this year. UNWomen has lost sight of its brief. Instead of defending our sex-based rights and working to eliminate sex discrimination, it has been redefining feminism, appropriating our language and destroying its meaning. Determined efforts by large funding bodies and NGOs to persuade the UN to replace the category of sex with gender identity are having an effect. Hundreds of millions of dollars have poured into UNWomen from groups representing moneyed male interests, including $100 million alone from Open Society foundations. UNWomen has responded to this by appropriating the language of feminism to declare a new feminism that includes worrying concepts such as bodily autonomy, adolescents' capacity to consent to sex, and the horrifying demand that all aspects of sex work be decriminalised. As a feminist far more knowledgeable than me said, this is not feminism, this is bullshit. So what did we do? Women volunteering for WHRC and other international women's rights organisations decided we should contact as many UN representatives as possible to warn them of the consequences of replacing sex and sex-based discrimination with gender identity, stereotyped roles which favour men and disadvantage women. We assumed the best intentions of UN representatives. Gender ideology is a wolf in sheep's clothing, presenting itself as inherently feminist and progressive while causing considerable harm to women and girls. It has progressed rapidly through UN agencies and national governments without debate or scrutiny. So many people, even those who should make it their business to understand the issues involved, are still unaware or perhaps unwilling to learn of the harms that gender ideology is causing. We pointed out that endorsing the idea that being a woman or man was not a material biological fact, but a metaphysical state based on stereotypes will do nothing to reduce the oppression of women. We warned that including this apparently neutral new language into national and international legal frameworks will not only disguise male violence against women, but will also dismantle any advances towards achieving substantive equality for women. We produced a letter and an infographic translated into several languages, provided some instructions, and encouraged our signatories to send it out. We also issued a press release and did some promotion on social media. You can find all these resources on our website. Other results. The Generation Equality Forum concluded with its global acceleration plan, in which the language of feminism is appropriated and redefined, and the new language dominates funding and state actions. Women and girls have been reduced to women in all their diversity, a new euphemism that includes trans-identified people, non-binary identified people, and sex workers. Bodily autonomy has been adopted as a new discourse that opens the door to all the industries that make profit from women and girls' bodies. UNWomen's remit to defend our rights has been effectively destroyed as large funding bodies representing these moneyed male interests demand that gender erases sex. Intersectionality has become the new in thing, and instead of referring to the intersection of different forms of discrimination, as mentioned in CEDAW, the new intersectionality simply means that males and their interests must now be included in every aspect of work to improve women's rights. The Global Acceleration Plan is a depressing, incoherent, and self-congratulatory document full of euphemisms and disguising language that attempts to hide its total lack of structural feminist analysis. It's like this, we think okay, have an effect on their agencies and associated NGOs, and they're starting to pay attention. The ridiculous affirmation of feminist principles was released shortly after our warning letter went out, which we think may be a direct response to our own declaration. The Global Acceleration Plan itself contains fewer references to red flag terms, such as sex work and children's rights, than we might have expected. We think sharing our messages is having an effect. We're enormously grateful to everyone who's taken part so far and have plans for more actions over the coming months. The last slide, what can we do? The UN and its agencies are funded through our taxes. Tax money paid by women all over the world is being used to erase our sex-based rights, our means to describe discrimination against us, and the language that defines our experiences. We believe these agencies must be held to account by those that fund them and by individuals. So-called feminist declarations, such as that published by the Women's Rights Caucus in 2020 and the recent affirmation of feminist principles, instrumentalise the global south in order to set an agenda, for example, for sex work, which suggests it is a viable income alternative for poor women. Feminists know better than that and understand it is a structural system of exploitation wherever it happens, using mostly vulnerable women and girls. We oppose this instrumentalisation and must act globally to make our governments in the global north accountable for the money that is spent to promote systems of exploitation. We know men are the main lobbyists for the total decriminalisation or legalisation of pimping, trafficking and sex buying worldwide. The Global Acceleration Plan from Generation Equality refers to action coalitions, groups of states, NGOs, and corporations that will be involved in carrying out their key objectives. WHRC intends to contact all the states, NGOs, and corporations involved in these action coalitions to pass on our warning about the consequences of replacing sex with gender identity. We'll also contact UNWomen's top 20 government funders to ensure all have a full understanding of what it is they are funding, and that they can see there are women like us who resist and are prepared to demand that they be publicly accountable for their actions. We're planning to produce a list of states, NGOs, and corporations involved in the action coalitions, along with example letters and suggested contacts. Any resources we create will be made available for your use. This week, we also launched a letter writing campaign asking women to send a complaint to the UN to let them know how gender ideology is harming women's rights. Anyone can complain. See our website for more details. Although taking on the might of the UN and national governments may seem like an insurmountable task, we believe it's still possible to make a difference. We know that letters signed by WHRC have been taken note of by officials at UNWomen because they've told us. There are 19,000 of us and growing all the time. We have power. If we speak up together, we can be heard.
So I'm really pleased now that María Laura Peña Nacrur from Chile, who's the Women's Human Rights Campaign country contact, is here. And María, thank you for being the country contact in Chile. Could you give us an update about the situation on gender identity ideology in Chile and any other developments?
Here in Chile, we are facing two fundamental changes. The first one is that our constitution is being changed. We have a year of work ahead for our constitution. Until this moment, they haven't talked about gender identity. Here in Chile is a quite conservative country, so I think nothing will happen about gender equality. This week also in the Congress, they banned two laws that attempted against women's rights and children's rights. They were stopped. So for us, it's a rather calm time, even though we are starting a presidential race, and there are some candidates, the more liberal left-wing ones, that are trying to win people by saying they will approve laws about gender identity and about prostitution and that kinds of stuff. We are just a start. This just starts, so we are just watching here. I gather a group of 6 women that we are working on being ahead of everything that is going on, and we are creating a system that we could talk to senators and politicians and people in municipalities that here are very important, so we can be ahead of what is going on. We have also created some boundaries. We have created a strategic with other activism in feminism that are also against the identity laws. So we are quite protective till this moment, and we are just watching what is happening, and we will start making things happen when we notice that we are in danger or something could happen. Till the moment, it's so here is very, very calm for us. The UN office here for women, the UN Women's Office, is just working with the Ministry of the Women in terms of what happened with the pandemic, and the loss of jobs of many women here in Chile. That is devastating for us. We have go back for around 12 years in terms of women jobs. So they're just seeing that aspect until the moment. So it's very calm around here.
Yeah. So how about WHRC? How long has there been a group of women related to Women's Human Rights Campaign? And what have you managed to do there?
I always, in my free time, I'm a feminist activist, and I have workshops, reflection and literature on feminism. So I gather a group of women that go to workshop with me, that move in different areas of life and in different kinds of works. And we are six, and they are all very compromised with the cause. They are very interested because feminism is just starting, and it started like a liberal one. And when women start to read and to study, they understand that there are some things that has to be abolished, like gender. So here we are doing a work, and we are creating strategic alliances so we can work together. For example, the law that was banned this week, one of them was just because the work of activism, and I work there, and I show my support and my name and everything. So we were around 50 women that gathered together to stop this. So I believe here we can do quite a good job in terms also of educating women and educating society why this is no good to have gender laws before women are truly protected.
Yeah. Do you have, Maria Laura, do you have liberal feminist organizations or some mainstream feminist organizations that are supporting transgender ideology?
Here, the associations of women of feminism are not quite important in terms of what they can do in terms of law. They are more important in terms of protecting women against femicides and that kinds of stuff. Because here in Chile, we have it's a really scary rate. So for the moment, the most of the organizations of feminism are working to protect women and children also against law. Here in Chile. The pandemic showed us that 80% of fathers that doesn't pay their tuition for their children. So that are the laws that women are starting to ask for. That we are well protected against violence, we're unprotected in those terms. So that is the main thing is in these days.
Yeah. And Maria Laura, what about you? Why did you become involved with WHRC, and what made you realize that transgenderism is a threat to women's rights?
I started taking courses, online study, more formal in different universities, and I started understanding that the problem, well, when you face feminism for the first time, you are wondering for equality in law, no? But here, when I took the course and I start reading different authors, and I understand that the problem wasn't the law. The problem is the oppression, and the oppression is because we are women, and because they conceive the idea that women have to live in a certain and have a certain things to do that has nothing to do with what we want. So that's how I start. I am an activist also in Instagram, and I start following different accounts of WHRC around the world. So I wonder why this is here in Chile, and how could I manage to be a part of it, because I believe it's fundamental. So now with the girls that I have gathered here, we are starting to create an Instagram account. We want to create it this month, and we are trying to see what information we should be starting to upload, so a woman will be more educate about it. Here, there are a lot of women that feel that feminism is important, but as I was telling you, no education. So I think we can do a good job, and because we are changing the president next year, they won't be there will be a lot of promises about things that involve gender, but nothing will happen. So we're safe for the moment.
So what was it about these Instagram posts that made you see or be attracted? What were they saying that helped you understand the issue?
I believe that what attracted me is that I think that when we're fighting by ourselves, it's so much harder. But when you start to articulate like an organization and you're backup, and if something happened in Latin America, for example, in Argentina, we can respond from Chile. That is very important. For example, here in Chile, abortion, you can have an abortion, but you have 3 causes to take the abortion. When we were fighting for those causes, the Argentinian sisters start fighting for the abortion for them. So they start shouting for us also. And when Argentinians were fighting their law in the Congress here in Chile, the Chilean women start marching down to the embassy to make pressure also. So here in Latin America, we are very working, feminisms are working all together. So when you have an organization like this that is worldwide, that you have webinars, that you have a lot of things going on, it's pretty interesting for us because we have more where to support ourselves from. We can reach for help just more easily. We have a lot of more things that are more easily than if we are alone.
Yeah.
So it has been great meeting everyone.
We're going to move to Evelina. Evelina is the country contact for Finland, and she's going to speak to us about what's happening in Finland. So I'll just introduce Evelina. Evelina, country contact, she's near me. She's country contact for Finland. Could you give us an update to remind us about the situation about gender identity ideology in Finland? Are there any new legal or other developments?
We are revising our law on legal change of gender. It will be presented to the Parliament on week 51, so towards the end of the year. And at the same time, we also have this initiative that is kind of, they also want to revise the current law. And there isn't much information available what the actual revision of the law that's being handed over to the Parliament, the content of that are very vague. We don't really know what it contains, but the initiative that's kind of going on at the moment, and it gathered around just under 70,000 votes in less than 2 months. So it has gathered quite a lot of momentum, and they are pushing for self-ID for minors as well. And they kind of want the legal change of gender to be a process where you just kind of go into a digital portal and you just do it there. Currently, you need a doctor's statement that you are suffering from gender dysphoria, and you need to live in the desired gender for 2 years before you can legally change your gender. And as there is some overlap between the task force in the official revision of the law and in the people behind the initiative, I think some of these topics will be discussed in the revision of the law, but we don't really know. There hasn't been much public discussion on this topic, but it seems that most political parties support the initiative, at least. And our Prime Minister gave a statement which was quite conservative. She didn't fully support self-ID, but she didn't fully reject it. So it remains to be seen. And at the moment, I think it's really important to kind of get the public discussion going, because so far it's been very pro self-ID.
Yeah, and Evelina, are there many women's organizations or any organizations putting the counter arguments, the arguments that gender identity ideology harms women?
Yes, and well, there's the lesbian, gay, bisexual organization that is kind of similar to the LGBT Alliance. That was founded in May, and they were immediately met with vitriol. They were called transphobic, and only last week, one of their Discord channels, which I'm a part of, was leaked. It was quite nasty. And then there's another one that's completely for women's rights only, for women's sex-based rights. And before this organization even got their website set up, the chairperson for the transsexual organization in Finland shared their names online. And yeah, so there are at least 2 or 3 organizations that I know of, and they have all been met with pretty negative feedback, and it's quite unfortunate.
Yeah, how about Women's Human Rights Campaign? How long have you been going, and are there many women involved, and have you managed to do anything to publicly or to network?
I've been trying to network with the LGBT Alliance. They actually sent me a kind of introduction that I would like to put on the WHRC Finland website, as well as I would like to get maybe a blog started, because I've met so many talented, intelligent women who have so much to say, and I think it would be a good outlet and a way to activate people. And yes, I recently managed to get the Twitter account going. I had some problems with that in the past, but now it's all there. That's good. And yeah, so far I've been translating the content and yeah, trying to kind of interact with the other groups and kind of create connections to them.
Why did you get involved in this issue? Partly, what made you think about or know that transgenderism is a threat to women's rights? And also, how did you find WHRC?
I'm actually not sure how I found WHRC, probably on Twitter, I think. But the reason why I joined was that during the spring, with the initiative and everything happening kind of around the world, it kind of made me feel like I can't just not do anything. So I felt like I wanted to join an organization to kind of do my part and spread the information on women's sex-based rights, and to kind of, because I think a lot of the current discussion is, I think it's like, it's well-meaning and people want everyone to be happy, but they don't really see what consequences and implications gender ideology has. So I think I want to kind of educate people on that and make people see that self-ID, for example, it has implications that are negative to women's rights.
What about public opinion? Do you think that most Finnish people agree with gender self-ID and transgenderism, or are they skeptical?
We celebrated Pride Month last month, and there were 2 quite big, well, one was a marketing campaign and one was just a faux pas. And the marketing campaign was one of the biggest breweries in Finland. So they launched this limited edition kind of can design where they use the English pronouns, her, she, and so forth, to kind of support like gender ideological movement. And it was mostly, I think, because people kind of saw through what they were trying to do. They were just trying to increase sales with this marketing campaign. So I think people kind of, some woke up to it, and I think in general, people aren't as willing to kind of accept it without discussion as in maybe other places. But the problem is that there isn't any public discourse at the moment. So people just don't know.
How about the media? In many countries, we're finding the media, the mainstream media, are very positive, particularly the television, are really promoting transgenderism and glorifying it. What's happening in Finland?
To some extent, yes. This is mainly about like corporations pushing this agenda. But I think it is something that at least the media supports, and any kind of objections to this, I know of several individuals who have sent letters to newspapers and to the government about the problems of self-ID that they have just gone ignored. Very recently, though, one letter to the editor got through, and it actually raised a lot of discussion, which I found positive. And it was, the person received a response from the Organization for Sexual Minorities, and it didn't really pay any attention to the concerns of the writer. So I think it reflected quite badly on them. But in general, there isn't, all the discussion is mostly on the Twitter and some closed Facebook groups, but public discussion it's not there. And media is very supportive of the gender movement.
We're now going to hear from Holly Lawford-Smith. Holly Lawford-Smith is a political philosopher, women's rights activist, and creator of the website No Conflict, theysaid.org, which is gathering anecdotal evidence of the ways in which sex self-ID impacts women. And she's an academic also, and going to tell us, give us a talk about how trans activists are gaming intersectionality and how gender critical feminism should not be intersectional. So welcome, Holly, and over to you.
I'm going to start with something biographical, which for me is where my questions about intersectionality became serious. So in 2019, a group of us in Melbourne were in the process of setting up a radical feminist group. At the first meeting, something happened which I experienced as dissonant, but which I also felt like I couldn't ask questions about. So as we went around saying what radical feminist issues we were passionate about and wanted the group to work on, two women of color said that it was important for the group to work on racism. I thought that's odd. Aren't racism and feminism two different issues? And then immediately, as if they were provoked by those women's contributions, a woman with a physical disability said that it was also important for the group to work on discrimination against people with disabilities. I thought, again, that's odd. Aren't ableism and feminism two different issues? And I started to worry about all the further social justice issues that there are that might be affecting different women at the table and which might then be put forward for our group to work on. So I wanted to work on feminism, and I worried that these further issues were changing the subject. Some of you who are listening might be thinking, yeah, that sounds like typical white woman reasoning. So for a certain kind of white woman, namely the middle class, able-bodied, heterosexual, non-trans white woman, the only thing that oppresses her is her treatment on the basis of her sex. So she rather selfishly wants to protect a feminism that takes care of all and only her issues. But I think the same reaction might have been had by any woman at that table. A woman of color who understood the way that racism and sexism could come together and wanted at least some anti-racism issues to be part of the group's focus might still have had the same reaction as me to the idea that the group should work on discrimination on the basis of disability, let's say. I think any woman at that table belonging to any combination of social groups might have thought, well, that issue is not a feminist issue. Now, if that table, instead of being the first meeting of strangers in our city's only radical feminist cafe, had been one of the round tables in a philosophy seminar room on my campus, I think I would have felt perfectly free to ask, hey everyone, I'm feeling confused. These issues strike me as something other than feminism. Can someone please explain to me how we're conceiving of radical feminism and what its agenda is? Can someone explain to me how all these issues, which at least appear to me as further issues, are in fact impossible to disentangle from feminism or should be part of any feminism worth its salt? In the philosophy seminar room, these kinds of questions are okay. Around that table, and I suspect in many newly formed feminist groups, they're not. We worry about not being in the know, about saying the wrong thing, about offending other women, and about coming across like a bigot. Indeed, not long afterwards, when a smaller group of us had broken away from the main group to work on opposing the sex self-identification legislation that was announced in Victoria that year, my asking of some of those questions caused quite a bit of trouble. So we'd had posters designed for an event that we were having on my campus on the future of sex-based rights. 2 women in the group wanted us to add statements about Indigenous land rights to all of the marketing materials for the event. I asked why, because again, it struck me that Indigenous land rights, as important an issue as that is, are not obviously a feminist issue, and in particular, do not obviously have anything to do with an event about the future of sex-based rights. First, I was accused of racism for asking, and then when I defended myself, I was accused of white fragility. So this caused a rift between the women in the group, and the 2 women making the accusations ended up leaving the group, which left us short on volunteers to run the actual event. I think that these reactions and what would have happened if I'd asked these questions at that very first meeting of the group can be explained by the understanding of intersectionality that has made its way into the popular culture. And I put it that way rather than just saying can be explained by intersectionality, because I think there are important differences between what the academic theorists were actually trying to get at and then how some of these ideas have in fact been taken up and implemented. So what seems to have made it through into the popular culture is the idea that there are many different axes of oppression, for example, race, sex, class, sexual orientation, being trans, and more. Then there is the idea that these axes can interact or make each other worse, and maybe even that they can't really be disentangled from each other. And finally, there's a kind of implicit hierarchy. We have a rough sense of which axes of oppression are better and worse, and we roughly believe that being impacted by 2 is worse than being impacted by 1, being impacted by 3 is worse than being impacted by 2, and so on. And all of this means we can always come up with a rough hierarchy in any given group based on a person's belonging to various social groups. And then there are norms about how to treat people depending on where they sit in that hierarchy. The more oppressed a person is, the more it is the case that they should be deferred to. Some other versions, popularized versions of academic ideas come in here too, like the idea that a person's unique lived experience gives her knowledge that people without that experience don't have. And that in turn justifies deferring to those people on matters related to that experience because they know more than you, or you have ignorance where they have knowledge. All of these ideas have something to them, but they can be overdone. So the norm that I would have been violating in that first meeting, had I questioned the inclusion of race and disability within our group's radical feminist agenda, would have been deference to the worst off women. As a white woman, I'm expected to defer, and asking those questions would have involved asserting myself as an equal. Asserting myself as an equal, treating all other women in the group as equals, both to myself and to each other, comes to mean failing to acknowledge privilege and to perform the social signals that we have developed on the left for acknowledging and repudiating that privilege. Similarly, when I later questioned the addition of claims about Indigenous land rights on our event's marketing materials, I was very much failing to perform those signals. For those people outside Australia, which I assume is most of you in the audience tonight, there's a very strong social norm here of acknowledging Indigenous land rights in the context of public events, no matter their focus. And this is in part because Australia has failed to make any reparations for historic injustice. But I think inside of feminism that is concerned centrally with sex caste, which I think both radical feminism and gender critical feminism are, it makes absolutely no sense to consider women as privileged. The movement is simply not about putting all axes of oppression together and seeing who is the worst off and working on that. That would be the approach of a generalized movement for global justice, but it's not the approach of a movement for women's sex-based rights and interests. Katherine McKinnon referred to this idea of the privileged woman as woman modified. She said, woman discounted by white, meaning she would be oppressed but for her privilege. Her feminism centers sex. She says women's situation combines unequal pay with allocation to disrespected work, sexual targeting for rape, domestic battering, sexual abuse as children, and systemic sexual harassment, depersonalization, demeaned physical characteristics, use and denigrating entertainment, deprivation of reproductive control, and forced prostitution. And of white women, and the way the concept of the privileged white woman is used inside feminism, she says, what is done to white women can be done to any woman and then some. This does not make white women the essence of womanhood. It is a reality to observe that this is what can be done and is done to the most privileged of women. This is what privilege as a woman gets you, most valued as dead meat. It's not remotely obvious that in any group of women, the one who will have had the worst experiences in virtue of her sex will be the one with the most identity features according to the popularized understanding of intersectionality. The wealthy straight white woman might have suffered a horrific childhood of sexual abuse, and the working class lesbian woman might have suffered only some sexual harassment and moderate verbal homophobia. So before I go on to explain how these ideas are allowing middle-class white men to claim to be the most oppressed, let me make just one clarification in what I'm saying about privilege. It's not that radical and gender critical feminists should reject all ideas about privilege. Indeed, they shouldn't. The concept of male privilege is important. So for the relevant axis of oppression, like sex, there will generally be a group with disadvantage and a group with advantage. And it can be useful for feminists to talk about male privilege and to expect men to do the work to unlearn that privilege. Indeed, some of the opposition to having men with gender identities using women-only spaces is that those men are likely to bring male privilege into the space. The difference is in focusing on the privilege of those who are advantaged by the axis of oppression relative to the movement. So for radical and gender critical feminism, that is male/female. So it's men and only men who have privilege in that context. That doesn't mean women can't have privilege in other contexts, they can. If an able-bodied woman goes to a disability rights activism meeting, she may appropriately be seen as having able-bodied privilege and be expected to defer to those with the relevant disadvantage or take steps to unlearn that privilege, including ways of seeing and relating to people with disabilities. The same goes for the white woman at the Black Liberation meeting. My point here is one about privilege and difference between women inside radical and gender critical feminism. And even that needs qualification, because of course no activist group is going to be successful if its members have discriminatory or otherwise shitty attitudes toward other members of the group. So of course, radical and gender critical feminists need to not be racists, homophobes, ableist, and so on. That's a precondition of working together effectively across diversity. But that is a very different thing to putting all of the social justice issues in existence onto the feminist agenda. Okay, onto middle-class white men and how they end up being perceived on the left as the most oppressed. I'm not, by the way, claiming that all men with gender identities are white and middle class. I'm just taking this cohort as the most dramatic illustration of the point. So imagine, if you will, a male presenting, fully male-bodied person who identifies as a woman and wants she, her pronouns, or a male presenting, fully male-bodied person who identifies as non-binary and wants to use they, them pronouns. Suppose that these men are both middle class and both heterosexual, that is, are males attracted to females. For the person who maintains a sex/gender identity distinction, meaning who thinks a person's sex is one thing and his gender identity is another, such men have one and only one social group membership that makes them disadvantaged, namely having gender identities. But for the leftists who have become convinced that gender identity somehow transforms sex, the identifications of these middle-class white heterosexual men catapult them to the bottom, or at least near the bottom, of the intersectional pile. The man becomes a woman and so is disadvantaged along the axis of sex. The woman is attracted to women and so is disadvantaged along the axis of sexual orientation. And the woman is still trans and so is disadvantaged along the axis of gender identity. So 1 point of disadvantage magically becomes 3, and our middle-class white straight man is suddenly a middle-class white lesbian trans woman. An example of this exact reasoning showed up in an Australian news article last year. So Western Sydney University professor Jane Ussher was quoted in an ABC News article about sexual harassment and violence against trans women, saying, "It's because they are women, because they are trans, because they are a woman of colour, and many of whom were bisexual, queer, or lesbian. So these different multiple identities put them at high risk of sexual violence." She's describing someone born male as a woman of color, and queer or lesbian, in addition to being trans. Even if we're talking about a straight male person of color, 2 becomes 4. So person of color plus trans becomes woman plus woman of color plus lesbian plus trans. So from this one entirely subjective identity claim, we get oppression along 4 axes, and a strong claim, therefore, to being the most oppressed. Middle-class straight white men start outranking middle-class white lesbians or middle-class straight women of color in the intersectional hierarchy. And this is absurd. The absurdity is both in thinking that gender identity transforms sex, which has knock-on effects for how we think about sexual orientations and compounded oppressions like being a woman of color, and in thinking in terms of total oppression hierarchies in the first place. So what's the solution? We solve the problem of men ending up anywhere on the feminist intersectional hierarchy by refusing the idea that gender identity transforms sex and insisting upon the sex/gender identity distinction. Sex is one thing, gender identity is another, and that is that. Radical and gender critical feminists are interested in sex caste, and so female people. An intersectional approach to radical feminism might mean being interested in a lot of other identity features of female people, but that never takes us to male people. So men gaming the system is thus ruled out. But we can't solve the problem of the feminist agenda coming to include all or almost all issues, and the problem of hierarchies between women inside feminism without getting rid of the understanding of intersectionality that has made its way into popular culture. I think that radical and gender critical feminists should commit, perhaps should recommit, to the centrality of women as a sex caste. I think that for the most part, radical and gender critical feminism should not be intersectional. It's a feminism for all women, but a feminism for all women, not as full persons. It should not be expected to speak to all aspects of women's personhood, just as no other social justice movement does. So consider, for example, Black Lives Matter or Extinction Rebellion. It's perfectly okay for a feminism to focus on one system of oppression, namely oppression on the basis of sex. And that means it's okay to bracket other issues, even other issues that affect women, but affect them not as women, but as people. So some issues really are changing the subject. The challenge for us all, if we commit to this, is discerning when something is a women as women issue and when it's a women as people issue. So one heuristic is to ask when the issue, whether the issue affects women of the social group more than men of the social group. So suppose a Filipino woman in Australia is struggling to get work and suggests to her local RadFem group that they put employment for Filipino women on their agenda. We might then look at whether Filipino women are struggling with employment more than Filipino men. Suppose we find it's roughly equal. Then we might think this is a race issue, not a feminist issue. And the group might then quite reasonably refuse to put this issue on their agenda. And this won't make them racists, only focused feminists. The remaining complication is for cases of what may be referred to as the compound oppression that can arise when two axes of oppression mix together. So Angela Davis, for example, talks about the fact that Black women under slavery in the US were subject to both slavery and sexual exploitation by the slave owners. As Davis puts it, the master would be subjecting her to the most elemental form of terrorism distinctly suited to the female, rape. This is a way that Black women are treated, but Black men are not, and yet it is a form of domination that is made easier by slavery. It will be difficult to argue that it's either really a race issue or really a sex issue. It looks like both in a way that's more than either combined. But because of its sexual element, it also looks clearly like a women as women issue. So there might be some compound oppressions between being female and other social group features that are novel in this way, and so create a difference with men of that same group, and yet are not plausibly about women as women. And in that case, my suggested heuristic won't work. So we do all need to have a further discussion about whether we think radical and gender critical feminism should be exclusively about women as women issues, and exactly what we think that means, or about women as women issues and all of the compound oppression issues that intersect with being female. The first produces the narrowest agenda, but the compound oppressions may fall through the cracks if most social justice movements focus on a single axis of oppression, like I think feminism should recommit to doing. Thank you.